terms of the sign-ups, we're expecting other people. Some of them we've seen recently, so we may be, but we want to affirm you because you're here already. So thank you for coming. I'm Meredith Higgins, and our other two presenters are Larry Schwab and Sandra Greenfield, and you'll hear more about them from themselves and me too. And actually, I think I'd like to wait in terms of introducing, because the other people that come will give it a few minutes, and we'll back up to this one. So this session tells you some things that two of the JPD adjunct staff and I have learned in working with many different congregations over the years, and I wanted to make sure you know about the JPD adjunct staff program. Most of the JPD adjunct staff come to us from congregations. We get to know them and they express an interest. There's two things that we look for, and that is active, dedicated UUs and good experience in facilitating, working with groups, because we don't train people if that's not their experience. But we get people from a lot of different backgrounds. We have some religious educators, some ministers, some therapists, and various other people who are on the list. And we have about 17 people every year. Not all of them because of either the request from congregations or their location or their calendar. Not everyone is available to work when we need them. But we work with about 20 congregations each year, plus some additional projects with JPD staff. So today, you're going to learn more about the adjunct staff program, about some of the programs that we do with the congregations, and especially with the two other speakers, the governance aspect and faith development. So, I mentioned that the people who are adjunct staff are dedicated UU leaders and experienced facilitators. So part of the reason I gave out these papers, well, one of them I wanted you to see, because it really gives you a story about, did you get this one?
No, I didn't.
Oh.
I got these two.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Anyway, this first one really doesn't have to do much with the adjunct staff, but if you read up from the bottom, it gets you to what has happened in terms of anti-racism, anti-oppressive, and multicultural efforts within the Joseph Priestley District over the past 12, 13 years. And Rob Hardy's, in his speech, was saying that we've done a lot. And you read this, and we have done a lot. Thank you. Great. I don't know whether they want to move there. That's not this one. So then the other two handouts are about some things that adjunct staff have come up with, because sometimes they have a good idea and they say, well, I could do this for you. And so the internet consultancy is one example where someone who has familiarity with evaluating websites and saying, well, yeah, this would really attract customers or not, has offered this program, and we say, yes, let's do it. And so that's another part of the adjunct staff program. This one, governance and climate change. Did you know that the JPD staff does a monthly leadership series of articles on a specific topic? Do you look them up and read them?
Well, I think, are those the things that we get on messages each month, leadership notes? Yeah.
Good. You get them too. Well, the thing is, we rarely know if anybody reads them. It doesn't come to one time somebody said something to me about my article. So it was
Just
really...
to say, I use it because I'm the denominational representative, and I present that material from there to our program council. So it's kind of seeping,
Good,
trickling
great.
down.
Wow, that's good to know.
Yeah, and anybody can be on the list, and I think if you go on the website, you can be on the list. So this governance and climate change is another example of initiative, because Larry said to Richard Speck and to me, I think a lot of people have some confusion about governance or some frustration. They decide to work with policy governance, and then they're this like, oh no, why did we do this? And so he proposed doing a workshop, which is outlined here, and we're looking for a date in August, probably.
When I saw the title, I thought it was about one thing, but it seems to be about something
I
else.
thought the same.
And it might be
Larry has
confusing,
this-
so I kind of get the in kind of joke, but it might be confusing to more than
Well,
anything.
you say that to him, and maybe the
Okay.
name will change. Because I said, well, that makes me think of environmental issues. But at the top of this, it tells you how to be in touch, because this is my letterhead. And there's my cell phone number, which is an easy way to find me, although it's a small font. And then the best email address for me is the higginsrfp@aol.com. Because we won't go into the long story, but sometimes I'm slower to get those messages if it's going to be anyway. Okay, so if you have anything you want to tell me or ask about adjunct staff over time, then keep that information and be in touch. Okay. You too may say, congregations might be interested in such and such. What do you think about offering this? And we're willing to give it a try if it makes sense. So the basic things that we do are some workshops. Most often it's a Friday night and a Saturday, or all day Saturday. And that includes search committees, board retreat, and startups. You'll hear more about those, but I'll tell you a little bit right now. The search committees that are searching for for ministers, they have a process, and if you look on the UUA website, there's lots of details. But one of the things, if you were to download the search committee handbook from the UUA website, it would say the search committee should have a retreat early on. And it's very important because they have to develop themselves as a team, and they have to think to the future about how will we decide difficult questions. And so there's an opportunity for stepping back and thinking about these things. And that's one of the workshops that I've done a number of, and you've done a number of. And so then I like to take this credit. Of course, they work really hard for a whole year, and they get all of these applications, and they go through them all. And I was only with them for one Friday night and one Saturday. And but the Cedar Lane Church is got a candidate, Avi Janamachi, and I worked with them last summer, and they will run a church I'm going to be working with for 2 weeks. But when Nancy McDonald Ladd came to them, I had worked with the search committee before, so it makes me feel part of the whole thing. Yes.
Just a question about search committees. I hadn't been on one in the UU, but I noticed, and maybe I just pay attention to these, there's several that I saw where they went on for a year and then couldn't decide, or there were no good candidates, and then they go on for another year. Are you seeing more of those or less of those, or is that kind of...
We recommend that the congregation now go through a 2-year interim to work on its
Oh, a
change.
2-year interim, okay.
2-year interim, and many of them don't start the search committee until the end of that first year, moving into the second year. So they're searching in the second year of the interim. But sometimes you don't know who it is that's going to be ready to seek a congregation when you start out a year in advance, because they're selecting search committees now, and you don't know who's going to decide to apply and who isn't. I know that there's somebody who was a very popular candidate that did come to the JPD. This is a few years back, but there were at least 2 congregations in JPD that had them as their first choice. So the person could only go one place. I've known about times where a congregation took 2.5 hours to have the meeting after a week of candidating, and they sort of reluctantly voted yes, and the candidate came in and said, never mind.
Thanks for that.
Right.
They're supposed to say. The
Right.
candidate's supposed to say that.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. So sometimes it's just something didn't work right. They didn't get their first choice, and their second choice just what they didn't feel was right for them. And of course, nobody knows exactly what happened, because that is kept confidential.
Is it happening more? It's hard to say.
I see.
It's 10 years ago, there was a whole new process that sort of came out of the dark and formalized a lot of things. But it does set up this whole year of trying to get to that final point and needing a huge number of votes from the congregation to hire somebody. And it can all fall apart.
There was one that I always saw about in Paramus, New Jersey, where they took 2 years to find somebody, and they stalled him, and then he only lasted 2 years, and then there was a breakdown.
That's a
And that's
different
happening a lot, and that's affecting the system too.
Yes.
Congregations are more aware of that.
And
That percolates up and down the system.
Right. And then the thing is, when you work with a lot of congregations, you see what are they doing with anxiety, and how, or are they being clear on what they're looking for? And so something needs more work when, after just a year and a half or 2 years, unless it's some big thing like they suddenly found a lot of plagiarism, or, those are very unusual. But I knew of a congregation that felt this great sadness because one of the questions in the startup, that's when the ministers have just arrived, one of the questions is, what kind of a relationship are we going to have in terms of social events? Because really, when a minister comes to a church picnic, the minister's working. It's not his or her relaxation time per se, right? But some ministers say, I don't want to be invited for dinner because that's a social event, unless it's a meeting that I should be at. But then when the congregation lives with something like for a while, they feel, oh, the minister's too cold. We want the ministers to be warmer. So it matters a lot what they discern in their search process, but they need to be clear on what they want. So
Yeah, I can see
all
that.
of these things happen, but I do also wonder whether the greater anxiety in the country when we have financial difficulties and things like that, whether fault finding, blaming a minister for what's not right, but there's lots of other things that are not right going on in the world. So, now you were going to ask a question.
Oh, no, it's fine. I had a comment, but it's not necessary.
Oh, well, then we'll speak up sooner or say, hey, Meredith, it's my turn tonight. I want to be sure that you're included. Okay, so the search committee is before the beginning of a new ministry, after the end of one. And then board retreats or leadership retreats are really to help the leadership team of the congregation plan or work together better or decide on the priorities. We work with them and make the agenda according to what their needs are. And we do that both in the general, like the board, but also committees that decide they need help. For example, you're going to All Souls in a couple of weeks, and that's to work with one of the religious education groups, the adult religious ed. Right. So that will be great because she moves them along and asks them the right questions, and they come away with, this is what we're going to do over the next year. So both of those are board and other committee retreats. Now startups, the startup is ideally at the beginning of a new ministry or a new religious educator leadership. And the JPD feels that it is so important that it's the one facilitation that we do not charge the congregation for. We pay the facilitators' fees, we pay their hotel, we pay their transportation, their supplies if needed, but we only go to congregations that invite us, you see. So you have to say, that's something that we're entitled to and we want. Because it's fascinating what comes out in those kinds of events where you're really getting started. It's not sort of the dating and getting acquainted and shall we have a relationship, but it's like, how shall we have a relationship? And so those are really very valuable. Yes.
In these, all of these circumstances, who would be your main contact with the congregations? Are they different people? Are they always the president of the board or the minister? Or
well, the facilitators, once we're contacted, and sometimes it's by a minister and sometimes it's by a lay leader, whether it's the president of the board or somebody designated. The facilitators always make a point to talk to the minister and the board president if we're working with the board to get their side of the story. I always send a survey, just a 3-question survey out to everyone that's going to be at the retreat or that's invited to the retreat so that I get a sense of their participation in their congregation and what their concerns are. Does that answer that question? Okay, so then there's one other kind of thing, which is conflict, and resolution is the ideal result, but conflict is what gets a thing on the calendar. And we actually have some people that are trained in healthy congregations, in conflict resolution and management, and in mediation. And so we do sometimes have a situation where instead of it being a weekend event, or there might not even be a weekend event, but the facilitator has a lot of telephone calls to figure out what people think is the problem they're having, and then goes and works with the appropriate people, either in in-person interviews or an organized meeting, and makes recommendations. So that's one other kind of way we use the adjunct staff. So I think I've used up my time. It's Larry's turn, and then we'll move right on to Sandra.
Oh, we wanted instructions from people.
The other people didn't show up, so let's do our introductions. So what we wanted to ask you was say your name, what congregation you're with, and why you signed up for this session, or why you came.
Okay, my name is Lee Paxula. I'm a member of All Souls Church in BC still, even though I've been there a couple years. I'm a student minister right now at the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. I'm a candidate for ministry. And actually I feel like I'm here because I feel like in my whole ministerial preparation process, a big piece that's been missing is nobody's ever really told me about what districts to want. FYI. So I figured I both wanted to come to the district assembly and also get a better sense of how the district role fits in congregational life.
Great.
Very good.
Thank you.
My name is Meredith. I am an interim religious educator in Acatink Church in Northern Virginia. And I came because I'm interested in that crossover between governance and lifespan education. That's a lot of the work that the congregation is doing right now.
Good, thanks.
I'm Christina Watts. I'm the chair of the Lifespan Education Committee at Adjunct. I'm here because of this interim time that we're going through with our interim person and coming up with the search for the new person. And we're also going through a process of developing our whole set of policies for the education program and determining what it all means and all that. So.
And we have to just say, she was at All Souls a while ago in a class of mine, and so it's just great to see her. Okay.
I'm Tom Rapash. I'm with the UU Church of Lehigh Valley in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I'm on the committee on ministry, and I'm the denominational representative. And I guess the committee on ministry, since we kind of try to oversee or at least observe how all the ministries are working, governance issues come into play a lot there. And governance area, shifting maybe from a family church from ministries to kind of a bigger, it's hard to kind of overcome that.
Thank you. All right, so Larry and
Okay, so thank you, Meredith. As Meredith was implying, I've been doing this for quite some time. I've visited a lot of churches, mostly in the northern half of the JPD. I've visited All Souls, and we were thinking about policy governance. And that kicks off really what I'm still working on and developing for August that Meredith mentioned. I've been facilitating a lot of board retreats and search committee retreats for quite a few years, and during that time this whole idea of policy governance has percolated throughout the UUA, not just this district. And from a facilitator's perspective, I thought it would be useful to talk about what the JPD's goals are in helping the congregations, and just what process we're encouraging churches to go through as they contact us and try to get some help from the JPD. How does the district help anyway? What can the district do? So we are developing this workshop, hopefully for August, about governance. And I got there by district mulling over this for many years, because I remember introducing it when it first sort of hit on a national level that churches should consider this. And what I'm discovering is that churches are diving into this idea of policy governance and finding that there are certain things that happen that may need to be addressed. For instance, what you may already be witnessing, the obvious things to me are that the board does all this and delegates authority and has vision, which of course is what the congregation always thought the board was doing. And that's not actually that different. And all this, gee, we're going to policy governance, doesn't necessarily strike the congregation as something special. But aren't you doing this already? we do now, and it's hard to teach board members what's going on. Quite define it. It's so difficult to define. And this leadership group is busy, busy, busy. Night, but this kind of model works extremely well for the JPD board because they can develop that end statement for Richard. They can say, do everything within our budget, and meet these goals within our budget, and they can come together every year and say, did you meet our goals within the budget? And he has to answer to the end statement. But to my mind, that's a little different when it's a whole congregation. It's a live, vital community that isn't necessarily just complying to an end statement. So that makes it difficult for ministers, I think.
Can I ask, I saw the end statement and I was really struck at the reference to within the resources available. It seems to be self-evident, and I'm wondering if that was, there was a lot of discussion on that, or
Probably.
Richard was saying, well, you can't ask me to do all this stuff and then not give me the money, or how does that come
It's
about?
hard to say. It's over a long period of time.
Well, yeah, the board does have a retreat every July, and one of the things that I think that I'm impressed with is, I guess I should be on the camera. Okay. So they give the ends, and the ends are like goals, but Richard does interpretations, and he says, you say A, Y, X, Y, and Z. And here's how I interpret it. That I will do such and such. And so in other words, their role is not to nitpick or direct the details of what he does, but he is communicating with them and saying, this is how I'm doing it. So it gives the opportunity for...
No, I was specifically referring to the reference to within the budget, the resources available. Because that seems to be, the rest of the document is kind of broad and overarching, and we want to achieve these wonderful things. And then you're hit with, but you got to do it within the budget that we have. And that seems to be self-evident. Like, you can't do those things with unlimited resources.
The way this process has worked over 10 years or so, or however long Richard's been there and the JPD's been trying to do policy governance, that's what you have at the moment. It's still a fluid, reviewed at the annual retreat, but that is the language that's developed in terms of setting policy. And so that's an example of what can happen with policy governance. Sure, it can be self-evident, it can be kind of obvious. But as we discuss this and we talk about governance, those are good questions. Are we just kind of spinning our wheels, or are we actually doing something new? It's a really good question. Anyway.
I was just going to add that I wonder actually if it's a reference to sort of his role in stewardship. That was sort of my thought about it, that part of his ends is actually also to steward the resources effectively of the organization in his interpretation.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and in policy governance, there are lots of limitations that really say don't do this, don't overspend the budget, don't. But what it's really saying is, within these parameters, do what you can to follow this.
It's a language thing. And that's part of where there are snags with policy governance because of the language. So it's all a good reason to have this workshop that we're developing.
And is the term ends specifically, which I find a little confusing?
It's a Carver.
Is that a part of policy
Yes,
governance?
That's Carver.
Okay.
I developed this workshop based on my training as a facilitator and working with all these churches. I developed at the beginning of doing this sense that there are two aspects of this. We know the logic of governance. There's a schedule, there's certain things happen on results are we have the staff who we have, they need to do their job, they need to be paid, and the board takes on a lot of that responsibility for those kinds of things. And there's a vision aspect of running a church and governance that the minister tends to take the lead on. Where are we going? Where is our faith headed? The faith aspect, the Sunday morning aspect, all of that. But there's another aspect, and that this has to do with the title of my workshop. There's climate. And this is really intriguing. Really, at your churches, there is a climate. There is an environment that people experience as part of going to that church. And it either feels good or it doesn't. And it has to do with a lot of things that the board is involved in, or the minister is involved. What color are the walls, or how nice is the building, or what did it feel like to go to a Sunday service, or how old is the building, or how are the grounds kept, or what attitude do people have, or how are they handling their anxiety, or whatever it might be. And it so happens that the leadership of the church is responsible for the climate in some way. And there can be good decisions that affect the climate, and there can be bad decisions that affect the climate, but they do come home to roost with the minister and the leadership of the church. And that's why I can change the name of the workshop, but essentially we're saying there is this process that does go on in churches, and leadership is responsible for it. And it has to do with something a little hard to define that is there, that has to do with what it's like to be a church member and go to that church and participate in the committees and participate in the activities. And I'm going to call it climate. And it so happens that these three things intersect in a really interesting way. And the board and the minister are actually finally responsible for, over a long period of time, I call it climate change. We can call it something else. We call it organizational change, or leadership change, or governance change, or something like that. But over a period of time, the organization is changing, and what the church is like is changing. And that's what I mean by climate. And it's an approach that I use in board retreats to sort of say, look, this aspect is hard to define, but it's also part of your responsibilities as leaders of the church. So the typical thing these days is that a church asks us to come in and discuss governance, policy governance. What is it? Should we be doing it? How is it working? Are we having these issues? I mean, there are a lot of other things too. It might be an RE group. It might be looking for a minister. But a lot of this is in the air. People are aware of this change going on. So it's worth for a moment thinking about how the heck this happened. What is it that led us to this constant awareness of policy governance, or changing governance, or changing the climate of churches? Now, I remember when I was just beginning to be a committee member, and I was on the committee on the ministry, and I was promoted to chairman of the committee on the ministry, and this was in the 90s, and I was told to go to this meeting. And this was all the committee chairs coming to a meeting at night at the church once a year to squabble over the church calendar for the next year. And it took hours. I have no idea why, but everybody finally got their chance to lead or squabble or argue with each other, whatever was going on, over who was going to do what on May 3rd and who was going to do something else on April 22nd at 7 o'clock. And then everybody went home, and I guess that was leadership. That was governance, except that the board was in their little cocoon, leading, doing everything else in this very rigid, non-collaborative, not delegating authority except about the calendar kind of way. And if the toilets went wrong, somebody went to somebody on the board. So the toilets don't work. Or whatever. And the church was structured in a very old-fashioned, rigid kind of way. That's what we woke up to 10 years ago. But a lot of churches were operating that way, and it just wasn't working well enough, and it wasn't attractive, and it wasn't functioning very well, and the climate was bad in these churches. That's what we're trying to get away from. That fed this whole idea that, hey, there's this Carver model, there's this policy governance model. We got to get away from this rigid, hierarchical, nobody collaborating, autocratic, nobody sharing responsibility model, because it didn't feel right. That was the beginning. Now that was happening in other parts of the world too. That's happening in business, that was happening in organizations, that was happening in nonprofits, it was happening in families. I'm a family therapist. This is happening all over the place. And all of those places and groups have evolved. And this is just the way UU churches happen to be evolving, away from that kind of organization. So, somebody said, how about the opposite? How about this idea of policy governance? So in my wanderings, I've come across something called adaptive leadership. And this is one way of thinking about governance now. If we buy the idea that the old model is just kind of stuck, this is different. You can look it up, you can Google it, you can say, what is this? It's used in the military. Okay? You think of the military as an old-fashioned, stuck system, but this is the kind of leadership they're trying to foster in the military. There's a difference between authority and leadership. Different kinds of people in your organization are good at leading, and others are good at holding authority. You know that new ad for T-Mobile where the cowboys walk through town, and one of the cowboys says, I'm tired of just telling people what to do. And I wear a pink hat and take leadership. That's the kind of change we're talking about. There are different people with different skills. There are mechanical systems and adaptive systems. The old-fashioned model is that churches or organizations or businesses are more like machines. If you're flexible, if you're innovative, so forth, you can be more adaptive. And it takes a different kind of leadership. And this is true all over the place. In businesses, there's been more brainstorming, there's been more innovation, there's been more inclusivity of different people in running businesses. And that got to be a bit much. That got to be a lot of inclusivity and a lot of people just kind of brainstorming, just having ideas. And businesses have now discovered there's a better sort of middle ground where there's some authority and some people who are good at leadership, and you kind of try to combine them and try to synthesize them. And Steve Jobs was very good at this. And he made Pixar very good at this. Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing has always been very good at this. There are companies that have been innovative and have combined these aspects of governance. And that's sort of cutting edge. And we're trying to bring that down to the congregational level. So, what are these ideas? Well, strangely enough, from Carver's own model, his own book about policy governance, he suggests some continuums. Carver doesn't necessarily say what some churches had thought he said, which is jump to the other end of this. Do the opposite of what you were doing before. Delegate everything to other people. Just go sit there as a board and wait for, some new vision, and then delegate. He didn't necessarily say that. He said there are continuums. The decision-making continuum. The old model that we're trying to get away from is always executive decisions. What we think of as Carver is that the congregation and all the leaders are always trying to reach consensus. It's kind of like the Quakers. Believe me, the Quakers aren't good at that either. I have stories. But we think of that as what they're good at. What Carver says is in the middle somewhere, some sort of blend of just constant executive decision-making and just letting consensus happen. He talks about the vision of ownership of a church, of a congregation. And again, this is executive leadership as the old model. And we think of the policy governance idea as the other end of this, sharing all of the power. That seems to be what we hear Carver saying, is can we disperse this and have everybody's voice and all of that. Really, he knows that there's such a thing as a covenant. Some give and take. Now, a lot of churches have said that we've got to go all the way to the other end. We've got to get really far away from this old model as fast as we can. We'll develop all these end statements and means and limitations and all this stuff. And then we'll be free of our old model and we'll function, we'll be growing, we'll be vital, and so forth. And then these issues develop that I talked about. So along comes another possibility. There's a fellow named Dan Hotchkiss, who is a consultant to churches, and he wrote a book about governance and ministry. And essentially he's saying that there is logic and vision. Again, there's governance and there's ministry. And he talks more about blending them together, and synthesizing them, finding a middle ground. So he talks about the board discerning a lot of information and having a strategy and delegating responsibilities in small task forces, not too many committees. And having boundaries that aren't too rigid and aren't too loose, but are firm boundaries so everybody knows their job. And then he talks about policy. And he says, start with a big mixing bowl, like the end statement we were talking about. Let's have a big mixing bowl that just says, meet the goals, keep the budget. Maybe that's good enough. And if it's not functioning very well, then you draw a slightly smaller bowl as the leaders, as the board. If Richard wasn't operating very well with that end statement, the Hotchkiss board would say, we've got to sort of draw a smaller circle around Richard. We've got to define this more. If that isn't operating well enough with a big sort of, he knows how to function within this, we're doing okay, big bowl. If it wasn't functioning very well, they'd have to draw a slightly smaller bowl and more language than that. And that would be the Hotchkiss model. So essentially everybody has a map. of how the congregation's operating. And each congregation operates within a model their way. Well aware of both ends of this, not wanting to get stuck here. Not having to be totally frustrated if they don't get here. What were we doing? We're failing. You don't have to feel that way. We can say, we're getting there, we're moving in this direction, at least we're not here. So all of this that we do to make these discussions happen or lead the workshop in August does actually have to do with the theme of this conference. Because we're encouraging this kind of thinking, which is broad thinking and inclusive thinking and multicultural thinking in all of the actions of the board or the search committee. If we reach out to a search committee or a board or some sort of leadership committee or an RE committee, we're talking about inclusivity, multiculturalism, and specifically with a search committee, we're saying, get this program into your church about categorical thinking. This is the time we all need to think about that, whether the program comes to our church or not. About categorical thinking. You know what I'm talking about? It's about the theme of this conference. The UUA has for many years sponsored a program for churches that are searching for a new minister to go through a facilitated program as a congregation to counter this kind of thinking. And it just means something very natural that we have to, as UUs, have to be very careful about putting someone in a category before we really know who they are.
Can I just testify to that?
Testify.
I'm not testifying.
Bear with
I was president of the board at All Souls from 1999 to 2001, and we did the Beyond Categorical Thinking. And the search committee, when the search committee started, most people thought we would get a minister who had at least 10 years of urban church experience. And the search committee unanimously recommended to us a 29-year-old young man who had minimal church leadership experience, a very interesting and very bright young man. And that's the name you heard this morning. And so the beyond categorical thinking helped us say, no, we cannot say somebody has to be a certain age, he has to be gay or straight or whatever. We have to open our minds and go beyond saying, oh, we wouldn't have one of those or we wouldn't have one of those. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. It looks like you made a good decision, I would say that.
Yeah.
But having been on search committees in the corporate or the government world, when you put out a position description to seek candidates, you have to specify what qualifications you're asking for. And so if you put that out, that you were looking for somebody with 10 years experience in urban ministry, and then you get candidates, some of which didn't have that, it seems like it would be unfair to the others who had the experience that you would then go with somebody who didn't have that experience. You see what I'm saying? In other words, if you set these standards and then you decide to take somebody that doesn't meet those standards, how is that justified?
Well, especially for a minister of a congregation, you're not looking for just numbers, so many years of doing.
So you didn't have, these weren't hard and fast qualifications.
Obviously.
I guess you were, maybe one hard and fast one would be that they have a degree, a divinity degree,
Right.
or an ordained UU minister or something.
Right, you don't.
But that's about it. To some extent.
So
It's a process. It's a year-long, like any search committee, but it is different from a corporate process in certain things. It's more personal. It's a covenant. You know you're developing a covenant. It's more handled.
My experience with beyond categorical thinking was, I was on a 2-year search committee. I was the chair of the search committee. It took 2 years to find the right person. And that program helped us to call the first African-American minister in the state of New Hampshire. But we had to work through that. I mean, I gave the congregation credit for, because the facilitator was skilled enough to help people say, not say that aren't politically correct. They spoke their fears. And that's what this program did, was to help us work through all those isms and all those assumptions that you make about someone, and to say this is a qualified minister. Our job description, this person meets our job description, and there's these other things that just are that we don't talk about, that we make this, of course in New Hampshire we make assumptions around race. There's only like 3% of the population is of color. So that program helped that congregation and that minister, not just the congregation and that minister, to be able to pair together around the issue of race. So it was. You can have a job description, but it's that some people might not want to call someone even though they meet that job description because of some profile or something that they are, what their identity is. So I think that really is what beyond categorical thinking is trying to get us to do.
It'd be extremely valuable if the UUA could afford to make every church do this. But they can only really tag it to the churches that are in search. That's all they can afford to do. It's a wonderful thing.
Can I ask a question that it might be better to answer another time, but something on this is making me think about it. Does the district do any work around helping congregations develop their own lay leadership? Yeah.
I mean,
Mhm.
a part of
Their own lay leadership
that might
within
even
the
be part of
congregation.
that might even be part of the board retreat.
Okay.
Is discerning that one of the goals for the year
Yeah.
is to develop more leadership.
But apart from helping the congregations figure out that that's their goal, is there also then like technical assistance?
Yeah, and I'll show you some things.
Yeah, some of it is explicit. I mean, we have programs that our leaders go, and some of it is a consultation, is a personal consultation with the congregation.
I think there's a tapestry of faith curriculum now too.
And there is a set,
Yeah.
correct? That's correct.
Just for fun, I'm going to show you some things. We were talking about search and just some things that might happen in a retreat. If I'm doing a search committee retreat, I might draw something like this on paper and talk about 4 aspects of ministry. Priestley, spelled not like the district. Pastoral, sorry about the pen. Prophetic, and actually the Quakers called it kingly, which is a horrible word for it. But the committee gets to understand that a ministry, gets to understand ministry better, which is part of this discussion. By looking at these 4 aspects of ministry and looking at where the church wants to go. A minister cannot possibly do all 4 of these things perfectly. So we're going to get some kind of part of ministry, of the minister, trying to do all 4 of these things. Priestly has to do with Sunday morning, and prophetic has to do with selling the UU faith to the rest of the community and drawing people in. And pastoral has to do with pastoral care, and kingly is the CEO function, this administering the church function. And they're not going to be terrific at all 4 of those things. And the committee gets to understand that and somehow transmit that to the congregation so that there's more acceptance of the minister when they come and they don't toss them out the door in 2 years, because so that part of our role is to keep these understandings, try to improve these understandings. So there might be this very explicit way of saying this is what ministry is all about. And you need some time, or how about
Yes.
Great.
Are you close to the end there?
Well, let me just say there's some other things I do, and you can ask about those. But I was going to say that on balance, what we do as facilitators is try to follow the different things I was just talking about. That we emphasize climate, that we talk about governance and ministry, and we emphasize multiculturalism when we can, and diversity, and that kind of about avoiding categorical thinking. And we do talk about group dynamics, just how the group is operating, so they understand themselves better. And I'll give you these handouts, but I'll just pass over to you. These are handouts that I use about those kinds of leadership skills, governance, leadership, communication skills, and so we emphasize those as well.
Okay. Thank you, Larry.
Workshop and all this.
There you are. Welcome.
So again, I'm Sandra Greenfield, and my role in the district at this moment in time is to work with congregations on their spiritual and faith development programs. I have been a religious educator for over 14 years. I quote-unquote retired last summer, having finished a 3-year interim position with Mainline Unitarian Church in Devon, Pennsylvania. I also come to this as a Unitarian Universalist for over 20 years, but I also am coming into this having an understanding of spiritual development and of educational pedagogy. I'm actually a doctoral candidate at Widener University in the Human Sexuality Education Program. So I engage with congregations around the issue of safe congregations, and have done that in my previous district, on the Our Whole Lives or other programs associated with that, and also on the underlying structures that it takes to be successful for the staff and the program to work together. So what I want to do today was to lead you and give you a sense of what we do when we work with congregations on the particular ministry of faith development and spiritual development, and what I also do for the startup, which has been a pretty rewarding piece of work that's being done within this district. I also want to, though, today give you a sense of what some of the questions are that I have observed, what some of the experiences are that I've observed, and around the multicultural, multigenerational piece. So what I do know is that when I work with congregations, the first thing that people want to do to reduce their anxiety is to immediately go to the what and the how. Just tell us what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it. And it's my job to go to the dream and the why. Because you can't get to the how and you can't do the what and sustain the how and the what unless you're really focused on the why. So I had this actually on my wall at my home, my desk, as I'm writing my dissertation. But it really does start with the dream. And here's a quote that I heard today, that Martin Luther King, when he was in Washington, D.C., he didn't say to the thousands of people that were there, he didn't say, I have a plan. He said, I have a dream. And that's what I know when people come to our churches, when the families and the youth and the children come, they come because they have a belief as well. And if we work on the why, then we're matching and we're bringing into our congregations the people who believe like us and know that they're in a place of like-minded people. People don't come saying, I always wanted to be on a committee. I wonder what congregation, I get on the internet, I wonder what I can find, who would let me be on a committee. That's not what draws people in, but that's what, when we go in to facilitate, that's where people start immediately jumping to, I need to solve this problem, without taking the time to really understand clearly what the problem is. So our work is to be very deliberate and reduce the anxiety, if you will, or to teach people how to live with the anxiety. I think it's unfair to say that we go in and help you get rid of the anxiety. We actually facilitate the process of living with the anxiety, because it doesn't just go away by having a retreat. But it really does, it's important to stay focused on the dream or the dreams, and that's what I do. So today's, the assembly that you've been participating in is asking what best practices are to grow as a multicultural and multi-generational faith community. I gotta tell you, I read that and I trip over the language. There's a lot of words here, and we're so enamored of the language and the words that I wanted to take some time for all of us to even understand, what does multicultural mean? What is multi-generational, and what is faith development, or what is it to be a faith community? There are some people that some of the language I just used would be unsettling. And I think if you look at all the words that are up there, could you pick one word that might be the most unsettling for a congregation or an individual in a congregation?
Faith.
Faith. That's absolutely true. So here, we now have this language. The UUA's department is not called religious education. It's called faith development. And yet that's probably the most provocative word that we could be using. And yet many congregations are using it, or at least it looks like they're using it. Some of the aspects of when I'm working that help the religious education program, and I'll just use that language for now. Some of what makes that operate successfully, because no program works in isolation, they don't work in a vacuum, is that we recognize all the aspects of what a person experiences about themselves when they're in our congregations. So we're concentrating on identity formation, and that really is the why. That's a big piece of the why. We're talking about, and Larry brought this up, the covenantal leadership. We are talking about multi-generational relationships, and I'm going to spend some time talking some more about that. We talk about spiritual development, and we also talk about faith exploration. And it's interesting to me that we will not look at those two as the same thing. That I have looked, today I scanned a lot of the websites of congregations in our districts, and they will have a category of spiritual growth or spiritual development, and then next to it they'll say education, as if they are not, they're mutually exclusive experiences, or they're separate entities. So I will be working with All Souls with their adult program, and they have religious education, and then they have spiritual development for adults. And that's going to be my first question to them. Let's talk about the language. Why is not spiritual development for the children, and why is not education for the adults? So we need to actually be sure we're defining the language. And what does that mean to be spiritual? There's also pastoral care, and there's another phrase that has developed, I'd say the past 10 years, the idea of the beloved community, and then the idea of justice making. So this, when you look at all of this, all of that, let me point to the screen here, all of that, that's a lot for what congregations are responsible for. I go in and work around the multi-generational piece, the spiritual development, the faith exploration, but not without recognizing the role that these play or understanding the overlap. So as a religious educator, I worked a lot with families and worked with people on pastoral care issues. And that is as much spiritual development as the justice making piece. So I think it's really important for us as your adjunct, as your staff, to help you clarify all of this language and to be sure that what it is. I think we have a tendency to think that if we call something, we just call it this, just by calling it multi-generational, it is. Some of the factors, though, that I have experienced that are impacting our religious education programs, things that I go in and have us look at together, is the mission and vision of the congregation. And actually, it's the very first thing I do. So I ask the staff and any volunteers, the lay leaders, and then look at the website. And I have I can tell you 9 times out of 10, when I have put their published vision and mission up for them to look at, most of them will say they never saw it before, they had no idea it existed, or they weren't actually doing that anymore. But yet that's what's on the website. So then I know I'm going to earn my pay by having to ask people to really think about it, look at that. Or they'll say, well, that's what the children and youth are doing, it's not what the adults are doing. The other thing so everyone actually knowing what the mission and the vision is, agreeing to it, and making decisions by this. It is not just something we put on our websites or our brochures to help an individual decide if their beliefs match ours. Those are tools for us to make a decision. If we're evaluating a program, it gets evaluated against, does that really meet the mission and vision of the program or of the congregation? The other tool is that we look at enrollment and attendance, and it's my job to remind congregations that the way in which we run our RE programs, there's a tendency to do the numbers game, where we only need a staff person for 15 hours a week because we have 85 children and youth in the program. And yet when I list all of the programs they're running, they might be running 8, 10, 12 discrete programs for those 85, and then they want to match a 15-hour-a-week person with those programs. So it's quantity, but it's also the depth and quality of a program. That's another thing that affects programs. That does relate to staffing. So if you have a vision or that you want to have your 12th graders when they graduate to have gone through coming of age our whole lives, they've gone to Boston, they've done a mission trip maybe, a service trip, and yet you have a religious educator who is there for 20 hours a week and there's no administrative staff, and the RE committee probably has 5 people. So trying to, that might not be a reasonable match. The governance structure, Larry and Meredith do a great job talking about that. Volunteer needs and management. So creating the structure that helps the volunteers be successful, and that's been my job all these years, is to help volunteers be successful. What resources you have, what facility you have, and then the context, and that is what this assembly has been about. It's the demographics, the cultural piece, and the geographic piece. Any feedback, questions? So as I mentioned earlier, there's the language is multicultural or multigenerational, and I went through the district's websites, and this is some of the examples of all the different language we've been using to define what we do for children, youth, and adults. We call it religious education, lifespan religious education, religious growth and learning, faith development, the provocative title, lifespan faith development, making it really more provocative, spiritual growth, pathways to spiritual maturity, Sunday school, and lifespan learning.
Is there any movement towards trying to make a common name or definition of any of these terms? Or is it just all up to each congregation?
That's a great question.
Well, I noticed trends. I worked as a DRE just for 1 year, but I've definitely seen trends, and actually I see a lot now more and more religious exploration, which isn't up there. That's a very common one.
Right. So I think that what I notice is that the denomination, if you go look on Beacon Street's website, they used to be called the Religious Education Department, and they changed the name to Faith Development. And many congregations followed suit, and I'm not sure exactly what process they engaged in to decide if what they were doing really was faith development. So, or is it still religious education? Is there anything wrong with it being religious education? And for some congregations, they have a very proud tradition of the education piece, and they would never rename it because it's informative for those congregations. My question is not so much what word we pick, it's the process that we're engaging in to decide what we're doing. And if whatever the name is one thing, but what is it that we're actually doing? Sure thing. It smells. So so one of the first examples, when I became a religious educator, it was religious education. I was the director of religious education, and then all of a sudden the language of faith development arrived. And I think it really, it wasn't grassroots. It seemed as if it came from look at me, Beacon Street. It went up the hill. You can tell I used to live near Boston. It went up the hill. What got called in the 80s because of a group of people that was called the Futures Committee, they identified learning as being a timeless event, that it wasn't just for children and youth, that the learning process, the transformation, which is what we do in our congregations, we go there to be transformed. And, they called it lifelong learning, and now we call it lifespan. Nice job, my typo, thank you. You can tell I did that this morning. What used to be called intergenerational is now called multigenerational by some people. And then what used to be called diversity is now called multicultural. So are we talking the same language? Are we doing the same things anymore? Are we at a place at striving to make changes because we are alive and vital congregation and denomination? We aren't static. We aren't stuck. We move. But my role as the adjunct staff is to ask you how and why. Really ask the why, versus just coming in to say, well, here are the best practices. So I can describe curricula that I see, and that's, again, that'll be some of the first questions that I'll get. So we have 7th graders, and we know that there's 3 congregations near us are doing coming of age for their 7th graders. So, well, should we do it? Should we? You almost have to look back and say, what's it like to be from the nursery to graduating high school and then being a young adult in your congregation? What's happening in the larger picture? That's the best practice versus just coming in with the answers that we have. So this fascinates me, the use of language and what it is that we're adopting, and being clear that my role is to ask that hard question of the why. What is the larger context and larger picture for the people in the congregation that we're serving? So I'd be interested to see what you all think. What does it mean to build a multicultural, multi-generational community? That's what everyone's here to do this weekend. So what are some of the thoughts that you have? What does it mean to you?
I think I would know, I have a sense of what a multicultural, multi-generational community is if I saw one, but I wouldn't know how to build it at all. So, in other words, if this were a multi-cultural, multi-generational community, I would see in this room people, men and women, black, white, other colors, older people, younger people. That's what I would get. But how to build that, as I say, I don't have a clue.
I think to me it means that everyone in the congregation has access points to everything offered in the congregation. And actually an easy way for me to think about an example of that is around, for the 1 year that I served as a DRE, one of the points I was making a lot was that we tended to think that what our kids need from the congregation is school, and what our adults need from the congregation is faith, is spiritual development, is worship. And can our kids worship at our church, and can our adults learn in our church? And I think similar things could be said about assumptions made. Young adults are in the congregation. What they want is justice work, and what they want is, but are there? It may be true that there may be trends, but are there actually access points for everyone to get all the things that the church can offer?
My sense for me personally is it's less for me about building, but being. And so we are already multicultural. Even if you walk into, a conservative walk into the room and it doesn't, the outsider doesn't think it's multicultural, we are multicultural. There are people coming from a lot of different places and identities and histories and experiences. And we're inherently multi-generational. So I think for me it's about being that, being it in a way that explores identity and faith.
I really love that, the idea that we already are. and we have a hard time claiming that because we don't take the time to think about our identity. When we see some of this language, it's about the other, but we don't really acknowledge who we are and what our identity is. So our identity could be based on gender and where we live and access from an economic point of view. It could be education. There's so many avenues into that core identity. And if you take the multicultural Renaissance module, I don't know if you've taken that, that's a program for people who are involved in religious education. There's several of these modules, there's probably 10, 12 of them at this point, but the multicultural one is relatively new in the life of that program. That's one of the first things you do as a participant, is you really look carefully at the identity piece and look at it for yourself and then look at it for other people. So I think that is so affirming to say we already are, multicultural and multigenerational.
Can I ask if you believe that you are unique or distinctive in that respect? And have you been to other congregations where you see that they are not like yours?
I think what I'm saying is speaking generally for our faith, we are. And I think I should be cautious in saying that as well, because there is always a potential of having a wider embrace in terms of who is in the room and who is in the community. But I think to say that we're not at all multicultural and multigenerational is something we want to build, we want to have. It creates this dichotomy that's not completely honest, but also puts each of us, whether it's the other that people are trying to identify often in this question, or ourselves in odd roles.
I think that's a really important point. Because I guess what I'm getting back from UUA and from JPD, because now we're here, we're focusing on that, is that somehow we're really lacking in this. And and then I focus on that. I said, well, yeah, we don't have very many black people in our congregation, so maybe that's what they mean. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, or what multicultural. I really like that idea. There's all kinds of stories in here and cultures already. But when you go in the room, they may not look like that, And I do think, at least on our services, because we take the kids out, the people that are there in the services all are kind of older. The people who are running the RE program are younger people, and then the kids. So you don't even see that at the services, that it's multi-generational. And they don't come together.
And I think in this we need to really be cautious of not being exclusive. I have this belief is when we each live into our personal identities in a way that's honest and vulnerable, we invite other people into that relationship. And so I think if we are being this community, we're willing and able to ask the really hard questions of who we're being exclusive to, who we're saying, not inviting in a holistic way.
It does the trust to recognize your own identity and to recognize you do have a culture. I think that's one of the reasons that I go in with the why question, and to work more around process and not necessarily even saying that a particular consultation was successful if we didn't leave with all of these goals met, because there's so much that people need to integrate and to understand about themselves and themselves in relationship to the congregation, to the committee that they're in. So I feel like our job as staff is not necessarily to walk away with product, but also to be very clear about process. And that we're even educating the congregations on how to do good process and to ask those kinds of questions and to create those environments where you can be vulnerable. Because that's what happens when I ask the why question. Unless people feel that they're in a place that they trust, then they can't necessarily get there to even begin to answer the why question. So they'll immediately go to the what or how. Tell me what curricula. But to answer the why question is harder. So when I look at all of this, I look at where we're going. Was that our time?
She's not, so we can go back to the closing worship.
Okay, all right. So Let me see what I got here. So let me just tell you about one last piece. So my, I said I was a retired religious educator. I don't think I'm ever going to be retired from this. I mean, I will not maybe have a formal position in the congregation, but my particular way of educating is the integration of sexuality and spirituality. So to me, that's still religious education. It's just, not in a congregation. So I spoke to several of my colleagues this week in preparation for this afternoon and asked the question, when did we start using faith development? And when did we start using lifespan? And in that conversation, I found out that there is a joint task force for excellence in shared ministry that was populated with music directors, ministers, and religious educators from those 3 professional organizations. Their results are being typed up. They will be published soon. The report's pending. But the biggest challenge was defining collaboration. Looking at from a staff point of view, that we do, the staff will do what Larry described. We will meet and do the calendar. And we'll walk away knowing what's happening, hopefully walk away knowing all of what's happening. But that's not, that might be cooperation, but that's not collaboration. And that's not looking at the gifts that each person on that staff team brings to the organization and make your decisions based on the gifts that you have in that setting. So that was their biggest challenge, is finding a way to differentiate, to define collaboration as being different from networking or sharing, cooperation, or coordinating, which is another piece of what you were doing, was coordinating. So keep an eye out for that report. I think this was pretty serious work considering the people who were at the table. Sarah Lamberts funded this report, and so if you're part of any of the professional associations or have connections to any of those, you'll see this report coming from the UUA. And I can't wait to read this. It's like the idea of excellence in shared ministry. The concept of shared ministry has been my philosophy from the first day I walked in as a professional religious educator. So it's exciting to see it happen that way. That's it. Any questions?
Any questions?
When is that report going to come out?
I wish I knew.
It's like imminent or like...
Where are we, April? I think they're hoping to have it for general session.
Oh, okay.
For the end of June, so. Good.
Thank you all for coming.